Some European countries are spending too much money. That's according to the European Central Bank. Is Europe's public debt too high? And what does it mean for the European elections? With me here to discuss is Zsolt Darvas, Senior Fellow at the European economics think tank Bruegel. Zsolt, in its latest spring review, the European Central Bank has warned that some EU countries like France and Italy are spending too much money. Is Europe really in danger of being too indebted?
There's a danger, of course, there, but I don't think that this danger is high. Now, French public debt is around 110% of GDP. In Italy, it's about 140%. Both countries had a budget deficit of more than 5% of GDP last year. These values are well over the 3% limit set by the EU Treaty for the budget deficit, and the 60% of GDP limit for the public debt. But also, the adjustment requirement is doable. Both countries and also many other EU countries will have to implement fiscal adjustment in the coming years, according to the recently changed European fiscal rules. But I think that this is doable, and I do not foresee a public debt crisis in the Eurozone.
Mm-hmm. And you just mentioned that EU rules stipulate that member countries are not allowed to run more than a 3% budget deficit, so spend 3% more money than they receive in taxes and other revenues, essentially. And according to that rule, 11 out of 27 members are spending too much at the moment. That includes countries like Spain, Belgium, the Czech Republic, and Italy. How did we get here? Are governments spending more than usual at the moment?
When the COVID-19 pandemic hit the world and the European Union in 2020, then all European Union countries introduced massive new public spending programs, first of all to save lives, but also to support the economy. Then 2 years later, energy prices skyrocketed, partly due to Russia's invasion of Ukraine. And again, many European countries provided massive supports, energy price supports to household, corporates, municipalities, and the like. So these very large, unusual public spending have to be scaled back. And at the same time, economies were relatively weak over the past few years. So yes, this situation is somewhat unusual. And indeed, about 11 countries have more than 3% of GDP budget deficit. This will imply that these countries will enter a so-called excessive deficit procedure. So the European Council will determine how much fiscal adjustment these countries will have to do in the years to come.
Excessive deficit procedure, this sounds kind of dangerous, but does this actually represent a big problem for the EU?
I don't think so. So first of all, the new fiscal framework, which has been just came into effect at the end of April, will stipulate that countries will have to do a fiscal adjustment to ensure that the public debt is sustainable. Now, this will require a certain annual fiscal adjustment from all those countries which have relatively high public debt levels. Now, for those countries which additionally have large budget deficit, meaning that more than 3%, then the new rules say, similarly to the old rules, that at least 0.5% of GDP annual adjustment will have to be done. But according to our calculations, all of these countries would need to do even a bit more to ensure that their public debt levels will return to a safe trajectory. So in my view, this excessive deficit procedure wouldn't cause any specific problem to those countries which will face it later this year.
Okay, but bottom line is some governments are going to have to spend less ultimately. Now, the European Parliament elections are happening next week. That means 400 million people will be able to cast their ballot on which party should represent them in Brussels. With inflation cutting into people's budgets, money is at the top of many voters' minds. In a recent survey, poverty and social exclusion were the top priorities of European voters, ranking above public health, support for the economy, defense, and climate change. So voters are clearly worried about money. What does that mean for governments who should be spending less?
Most European Union governments will have a relatively little room for maneuver in terms of their overall spending, because if there is the public debt is too high or the budget deficit is too high, they have to cut national spending or increase taxes. None of these measures are popular. But what governments can also do at the same time is to try to rationalize their current spending. In every budget, wasteful spending and parallel spending can be found. So in addition to cutting overall levels of spending, they should find savings, sensible savings, and obviously they should prioritize those spending which are most relevant for the voters, including measures alleviating poverty and social exclusions.
Now, the far right has increased in popularity across Europe, whether that's the AfD here in Germany, the National Rally in France, or the governing Brothers of Italy party of Giorgia Meloni. Many are predicting that radical right parties will also gain seats across the EU this election. If that does happen, what impact would these parties have on spending policies?
Now, first, let me recall that 5 years ago, the same fear was raised and it didn't materialize. Now, it wouldn't imply that it would not happen this time again, but I don't expect that there will be a massive gain for far-right party across Europe. Now, we also seen that, for example, in Italy, some of the parties in the government are considered to some extent extreme. Yet, the Italian government in the past few years did a relatively, sensible fiscal policy. So whenever even an extreme party comes to power, then those party leaders, will face the reality that, if the budget deficit is too high or the public debt is too high, then, they should be very, very careful on how they spend the money, because if they don't, their country might face, a major lack of confidence, which can result in a rise in interest rate. And, the one thing that nobody wants to do is paying more interest on public debt. So also when power comes with responsibility, and responsibility will necessitate sensible economic policies.
Speaking of interest, in 2022, the European Central Bank began hiking interest rates to bring down soaring inflation. Currently, interest rates are at a 22-year high at 4.5%. Now, recently, Eurozone inflation has been on a gentle downward slope, and the ECB is expected to cut interest rates next week. Would this give governments more room to spend?
Not really, because the expected cut is 25 basis points. So let's say from 4% to 3.75%. Now this is certainly something, not keeping the rates unchanged, but it go down, and it might go down also later in the rest of the year. But overall, I wouldn't expect very big interest rate cuts in the coming years. Moreover, the new interest rate only applies on the borrowing, which comes after the rate cut. But, Italy with 140% of public debt, the existing debt will continue to pay the interest rate at which Italian governments borrowed in the past. So even if interest rates go down, it will take a long time until the average borrowing cost also goes down. So I'm afraid this will offer little relief for governments.
Okay, you don't sound so pessimistic for the immediate future, but with inflation going down and interest rates going down as well, even if just a little, do you reckon too much debt will continue to be a problem in the years ahead for countries across Europe?
one always have to be, vigilant, but overall, I'm not very much concerned. And the reason is that the 60% of GDP public debt ratio limit, which is in the European Union Treaty, is much lower than what European Union countries can sustain. I mean, we can look at, public debt in the United States, 130-40%, or Japan, more than 200% of GDP. So I think the 60% rate is very low. And if countries have somewhat higher, let's say around 100% of GDP rates, I think they can sustain it without risking higher rates or a fiscal crisis. So I'm less worried, but certainly what we have seen in the past, that many countries violated European Union fiscal rules. Whenever they saw an opportunity, they try to spend more. So in fact, it might be better to set the benchmark, at a lower rate, 60%, than what could be sustainable, and push countries towards this level, because certainly this will create safety. But still, I don't consider the current situation, even the years to come, to create a high likelihood of a fiscal crisis in Europe.
Zsolt Darvas, thanks so much for talking to us.
Thank you very much for the interview.